In 2014, a 19-year-old college dropout was the youngest self-made female billionaire on Earth. She wore the same black turtleneck every day, spoke in a voice that didn't quite sound like hers, and she had convinced the most powerful men in America that she had built a machine that would change medicine forever. There was just one problem. It didn't work. This is the story of Theranos. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes. She was a chemical engineering student at Stanford, 19 years old, and she had an idea. The idea is a machine, the size of a desktop computer, that could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood. No needles, no vials, no labs. She told her professors she had cracked the science. They told her it was impossible. She dropped out anyway. She took her tuition money, she founded a company, and she gave it a name that sounded like a promise. Theranos, a word she invented from therapy and diagnosis. She was going to detect cancer before it spread, save lives that should not have been lost. It was a vision so powerful, so emotional, so American, that for the next 12 years, nobody asked the one question that mattered. She had a gift. She could walk into a room of investors, men 3 times her age, men who had built empires, and she could sell them a dream so vivid, they would write her checks for millions of dollars. She had something else too, a look, a voice, a presence that made grown men believe she was the next Steve Jobs. She studied his speeches. She copied his clothes. She built her entire identity around the idea that she was destined for greatness. And the world bought it. As a child, she was not like other children. When a relative asked the young Elizabeth what she wanted to be when she grew up, she did not say a doctor or a teacher. She said, a billionaire. She taught herself Mandarin. She talked her way into Stanford's labs before she had even finished high school. By the time she arrived on campus, she wasn't looking for an education. She was looking for a way out of one. She called it the Edison, named after Thomas Edison himself, a machine that was supposed to do what no laboratory on Earth could do: run 240 different blood tests from a single drop in under 30 minutes. For decades, this kind of testing required tubes of blood, trained technicians, a hospital lab, days of waiting. Holmes promised to do it in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. If it worked, it would be one of the greatest medical breakthroughs of the century. So she told everyone that it worked. She started giving speeches. She walked onto stages in that black turtleneck. She spoke in that deep, deliberate voice. She talked about her uncle, who had died of cancer while she was a child. She said her machine could have saved him. She said it could save millions of others. She told a story so personal, so emotional, so cinematic, that the audience never noticed she wasn't actually showing them how the machine worked. She just kept talking about why it mattered, and people wept. The board she assembled was unlike any in Silicon Valley history. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State; George Shultz, former Secretary of State; James Mattis, future Secretary of Defense; William Perry, former Secretary of Defense; Rupert Murdoch, media billionaire. Not one of them was a doctor. Not one was a scientist. Not one had the expertise to question what Holmes was actually building. But every one of them lent her their reputation. And that reputation was worth billions. One member of her board had a particular vision. General James Mattis wanted the Edison on the battlefield. He imagined wounded soldiers, tested in seconds, in the field, by a device that fit in a backpack.
It was a beautiful idea. It was also a terrifying one, because the machine he wanted to send to war could not reliably read a single drop of blood. By 2014, Theranos was valued at $4.5 billion. By 2015, that number had doubled, $9 billion, for a machine the public had never independently tested.
Holmes was on the cover of Forbes, Fortune Incorporated, Time. She was profiled by The New Yorker. She was praised by Vice President Joe Biden. She was named one of the most influential people in the world. She was 29 years old, and she was lying about almost everything.
In June 2014, Fortune magazine put her on the cover. The story called her a visionary. It compared her to Jobs, to Gates. It barely questioned whether the technology actually worked. And once that story ran, every other outlet followed.
Forbes, Time, The New Yorker. Each one citing the last. A myth, repeated often enough, stops sounding like a claim and starts sounding like a fact. In September 2013, Theranos launched in Walgreens. 40 stores across Arizona and California. Real customers, real blood draws, real test results that would be used to make real medical decisions. The dream was finally meeting the public. The problem was, the machine still didn't work. Inside Theranos, no one was allowed to see the whole picture. Engineers were forbidden from talking to the scientists. Teams were walled off from one another. Employees signed brutal non-disclosure agreements. The man enforcing it all was Sunny Balwani, Holmes's second-in-command, and, secretly, her boyfriend. A company built on a lie has to keep its own people from comparing notes. Behind the curtain, inside a secret room at Theranos headquarters, were dozens of machines. But they weren't Edison machines. They were Siemens machines, commercial blood analyzers that any lab in the country could buy. Theranos was running its tests on someone else's hardware. It was inaccurate. It was unreliable. It would give wildly different results on the same blood sample, taken minutes apart. So Holmes did the only thing she could. She faked it. Here is the problem no investor wanted to understand. A single drop of blood is tiny. To run dozens of tests from it, Theranos had to dilute that drop. Again and again. But every time you dilute a sample, you distort the result. The chemistry simply does not allow it. 240 tests from one drop was not a hard engineering challenge. It was, by the laws of chemistry, impossible. And the scientists inside Theranos knew it. Patients walked into Walgreens. They sat down. They had their blood drawn. They were told their results came from the Edison. They didn't. Some were tested on the Siemens machines. Others were tested using Theranos's own diluted samples, which produced results so unreliable that internal scientists called them garbage. Tests for HIV, for cancer markers, for pregnancy, for diabetes. Patients received wrong results. Wrong in both directions. Some were told they were sick, when they weren't. Others were told they were healthy, when they were not. And every one of them believed they were getting the truth. One of them was Ian Gibbons, the company's chief scientist, a brilliant biochemist who had worked on the technology for years, and who understood better than anyone that it did not work.
He raised his concerns. He was sidelined.
In 2013, under immense pressure, and the night before he was due to give testimony in a lawsuit against the company, Ian Gibbons died. Theranos's response to his widow was a letter demanding the return of confidential documents. There was a woman who was told she might be miscarrying. Her Theranos test had returned abnormal hormone levels. She spent the night in an emergency room. She was fine. There was a man told he might have prostate cancer. His Theranos test showed elevated markers. He didn't. There was a woman whose Theranos thyroid results were so wrong. She was placed on medication for a condition she did not have. These are the people the headlines never named. They received their results. They made decisions. They lost sleep. They cried in cars. They called their families. They were not statistics. They were not collateral damage. They were the entire reason Theranos was supposed to exist. Their names rarely made the headlines. A woman in Arizona told her cancer might have returned. A false alarm that cost her weeks of terror. Patients whose medication was changed, based on results that were simply wrong. Thousands of tests eventually voided. Each voided test was a person, a decision, a night spent afraid. The technology never reached the battlefield, but it reached them. In October 2015, a Wall Street Journal reporter named John Carreyrou published an investigation. He had spent months talking to former Theranos employees. Many of them were terrified. One of them was Tyler Schultz, the grandson of George Schultz, the same George Schultz on the Theranos board. Tyler had seen the truth from the inside. He had seen the failed tests. He had seen the false results. He had seen the cover-up. And he had decided he could not stay silent. His testimony, and the testimony of others, would bring the entire empire down. Telling the truth came at a price. Tyler Schultz and a colleague named Erica Chung had seen the fraud from the inside. When they spoke up, Theranos came after them. Private investigators followed them. Lawyers threatened them. Tyler's own grandfather, a Theranos board member, sat across the table as company attorneys pressured his grandson to sign. Erica met the journalist in parking garages, afraid she was being watched. This is what it costs, to break an empire's silence. Holmes called it lies. She went on CNBC. She insisted the technology worked. She blamed the journalist. She blamed disgruntled employees. She did not address a single piece of evidence. But the evidence could not be unaddressed. Walgreens shut down the testing centers. The FDA banned the Edison. Regulators voided 2 years of patient results. Investors filed lawsuits. In June 2018, Holmes and her partner Sunny Balwani were criminally indicted on multiple counts of fraud. $9 billion gone. Then came the regulators. Government inspectors examined the Theranos lab and found it so dangerous it posed immediate jeopardy to patient health. The Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes with massive fraud, raising $700 million on lies.
The valuation that once read $9 billion was revised to 0.
In January 2022, a jury found Elizabeth Holmes guilty, 4 counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. In November, she was sentenced, 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. And what of Sunny Balwani? The man who ran the labs, who enforced the secrecy, who, prosecutors said, knew exactly what the numbers really showed. He was tried separately. He was convicted on 12 counts. And he was sentenced to nearly 13 years in federal prison, longer than Holmes herself. The partnership that built the lie ended in 2 separate cells. The black turtleneck came off. She walked into prison in May 2023, heavily pregnant with her second child. The girl who was supposed to be the next Steve Jobs was now federal inmate number 24965-111. Theranos is gone. The Edison machines were destroyed. The patents were dissolved. The labs were closed. But the question that should haunt every investor, every politician, every journalist who ever stood beside her is how she did it. How a teenager, with no medical training, convinced the most powerful men in America that she had performed a miracle, when the machine never worked at all. Maybe the truth is, we wanted to believe her, and empires built on what we want to believe always fall. If this is the kind of story you want to know more about, subscribe to Empire Omitted, because the truth doesn't stay buried forever.